Hi, sixth graders. This cycle, your project for art class is all about landscapes in art. So make sure that you watch this entire video where I talk about the 4 different parts of a landscape, because if you understand the different parts that make up a landscape, you will be able to make a landscape artwork a lot more successfully. It will definitely look a lot better if you understand what creates that artwork. Also, what I'm going to talk about in this video, there will be questions on a Google form that you will have to answer, and you may not know the answer to those things if you don't listen to this whole video, okay? All right, so let's get started. So first of all, what is a landscape? A landscape is a picture representing a view of natural inland scenery. And even more simply put, a landscape is an artwork with land in it. As you can see that example right there, right? So we can see some land at the bottom, and then we can also see some mountains going up further into the background, and the sky there as well. And so that's basically what a landscape is, right? The word land is in that word to help you remember that. All right, so there are 4 main parts of a landscape. The first one we're going to talk about is the foreground. So notice that that's all one word, F-O-R-E-G-R-O-U-N-D. So we're talking about the ground, right? This is the part of the landscape that is closest to us, right? Closest to us, the viewer. So if you look at that example below there, that photo, notice that I have the foreground circled in red, okay? I want you to take a look at that. You can see the most visible details in the foreground. So if you look at those trees there right at the bottom of the picture, you can see lots of details in those trees, right? You can see clumps of leaves, you can see darker parts and lighter parts in the leaves. If you look at those buildings, you can see details like windows, you can see the color of the building and of the roof, and same thing with the rocks right down there at the bottom, right? So lots of details there, and the colors are often the brightest in the foreground. So when you think of the foreground, think about this is the ground that if you were going to walk onto this landscape, it's the part of the landscape that you would step onto first, okay? All right, so that's the first part of the landscape. The second part of the landscape is the middle ground. Okay, so that's 2 separate words, middle and ground. And this is the part of the landscape that is in the middle, right? So that makes perfect sense. That'll be super easy for you to remember. So if you look at the picture below, you see what I have circled there. It is the part of the landscape that is right after the foreground. So there's no space in between the foreground and the middle ground. As soon as the foreground ends, the middle ground begins. So it's that little section of land there that's not the closest to us, but it's also not the farthest away. And then same thing with those rocks, right? Those big rocks there on either side of the picture. They're not the closest part, but they're also not the farthest away. So it's right in the middle ground. Okay, so this is the section that has some details, right? We can definitely see, different values, light and dark areas in the trees and on the rocks, details on the rocks. So it definitely has some detail, but not as many details as what we see in the foreground. And that's because it's a little bit further away, right? As things get farther away from us, our eyes aren't able to see quite as many details. All right, the third part of a landscape is the background. And this is the part of a landscape that is past the middle ground, and it also includes the sky. So it's the part that's the farthest away from us, right? So I want you to notice that I have that circled down below there, and I want you to look at that word, background, okay? A lot of kids leave out the letter G when they're saying or writing out the word background. So we're talking about the ground that's way in the back, right? So we have those mountains way out there. There's a little strip of land right past those big rocks on either side of the image. And it actually also includes the sky, because it's everything that's the farthest away from us, and the sky is pretty far away, okay? All right, and this section, the background, has, excuse me, has the fewest visible details because it's so far away, right? And like I said, it also includes the sky. Now, you guys use the word background when you're looking at photos of things that are not landscapes, right? So these terms can translate over into any photo that you're talking about. Let's say that there's a picture of you and a group of friends, or you and a group of family members, and you're looking who's way in the back of that group. You're going to say, oh, look, here's so-and-so in the background, right? So these are not like foreign terms that can only be used when we're talking about landscapes. They can translate over into other things. You might say, oh, right there in the front. The front is the same thing as the foreground, right? So you say front, but you understand it could also be like the foreground. Same thing with the middle ground, okay? So kind of relate these things to words that you're already saying to help you remember foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay, so that covers the 3 sections of the landscape, but there is also a 4th part of a landscape, and that is the horizon line. So check out the horizon line. I've drawn it in the picture down below there, and this is the line where the earth seems to meet the sky. Okay, so it is that line, so you got to find the part of the land that's way furthest away, right on the edge of the sky, and if you trace that along with your finger, that is the horizon line. Okay, so those are the 4 parts of the landscape: foreground, middle ground, background, and horizon line. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about, because this will be included in the landscape that you make in class, is atmospheric perspective. This refers to how the atmosphere affects how we see objects as they recede in the distance. And the landscape picture below there is a really good example of this. So I want you to look at the part of the landscape that's in the foreground and notice the color of it, right? It's brown, light brown, dark brown. We can see trees. And then I want you to look as we go further back into the middle ground and background, how the mountains, they almost start to look blue, like gray and then blue. And that is because there is so much atmosphere in between us and them that we even start to lose the detail of color, right? The mountains start to take on the color of the sky. They start to turn gray, they start to turn blue. Okay, so that is what we call atmospheric perspective. And you guys will be, like I said, applying a little bit of this atmospheric perspective knowledge into your landscapes that you're going to make in class. Okay, so a little bit more about atmospheric perspective. This indicates that an object recedes into the distance that's relative to you, the viewer, so things that are getting farther away, and you see that object a little less clearly, right? The value, the color of that. So if you look at those mountains way in the background at like the end of that river in the picture below, the color of it, the saturation, so like the intensity of that color, everything's reduced because it's so far away. And if you look out the window in the art room, right, you will be able to see this exact same thing, this atmospheric perspective happening in real life right outside, or maybe if you have a view of a landscape out your window at your house, you'll be able to see that too, right? Mountains or land that's super far away starts to look like a different color. It starts to lose the color of the trees or the land, whatever it is, and starts to kind of look bluish or grayish, okay? All right, so I want you to look at this image here. Can you identify the parts of this landscape? Okay, so first we have the foreground. So look at this landscape here. Which part of the landscape is the closest to you? If you would walk into this landscape, which part of the land would you step onto? So notice that section of the land, kind of mentally circle that section of the land, and then think that's the foreground, right? And there's like a tree that's in that part of it, right? That tree, it sticks up into the sky a little bit, but the whole tree, that's in the foreground, so that whole section, including the tree, that's in the foreground there. Okay, and then the middle ground. What section of this landscape is not in the foreground, it's not closest to us, but it's also not the furthest away, right? So check that out, okay? So to kind of make a mental note of what that is, and I'm going to show you where these different sections are in just a second. And then what about the background? Which part of the landscape here is the farthest away from us? Remember, the background is also going to include the sky, so make a mental note of where the background is. And then last, the horizon line. Remember, the sky and the land, that singular line where those two things meet, that's the horizon line. This one's a little tough to tell on the left because of all those clouds. So you could just do your best and kind of figure out where you think the horizon line would be. All right, so I'm going to reveal where those different sections are, those 4 parts of a landscape. Here we go. All right, foreground, middle ground, background, and horizon line. All right, did you get those different sections correct? I hope you did. If you didn't, maybe you need to watch the video one more time. If you did get them correct, you can now move on to the Google form and answer the questions about the 4 parts of a landscape. All right, good luck.